As mentioned, my name is Jonathan Fernandez, joined here by Matthew Scott as well from CyberArk, and really looking. One moment. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that now. Really looking at the integration between Tenable and CyberArk, being able to have a look at all of those different assets on the network, performing credentialed scans is very important for that. About 20 years ago, Renault, who is now our CTO, decided for a school project to have a look for a vulnerability product that he could use. And he found that there wasn't really anything on the market or even an open source that was easy to use. So he created what has now become Nessus. And a number of people on here today will be familiar with Nessus or have heard of Nessus. It's really one of those products which has evolved as our networking has evolved. We think about 20 years. We had our servers. Generally, they would have been physical. Very few people in comparison today had laptops. Nowadays, especially with so many people working from home, people have got laptops, they've got their mobile devices. Networking has proliferated as well. We've got our external assets and our web applications, either internal or external. Our containers as well, if you're performing container security, using containers and Docker at the moment. And we've also got the IoT devices, even if it's just something that someone brings in to listen to a bit of radio in the workplace. And a number of organizations now are getting more and more, the IT organization is converging with the OT, so the operational technology organization as well. And being able to see all of those assets and all of those devices on the network is extremely important, because without that, we won't see the vulnerabilities that are on the network as well. And it's not just being able to see all of those assets. Just last year alone, there were over 17,000 vulnerabilities. And, I know from experience, that's virtually impossible to tackle all of those vulnerabilities. Whether we're looking at, just Windows desktops, for instance, there are other assets out there that aren't maybe so easy to patch. OT springs to mind immediately. We're looking at production lines and so on. So you can't just go ahead and patch everything that's in your environment straight away. There are windows that you can use to do this. But before we can see everything, we need to scan everything, and we need credentials for that as well. And then we need to be able to predict what actually matters. Out of those 17,000 vulnerabilities, a lot of customers only look at the highs and the criticals, and that's between 60 and 70% of all the vulnerabilities out there, which is a huge amount to try and tackle. Only about 7% of vulnerabilities have an exploit attached to it, and only about 3 or 4% of those exploits are being actively exploited at the moment. I'll talk about our Tenable research organization, the arm of the organization, in a moment, but they have produced for us predictive prioritization, which enables our customers to focus on exactly what matters first. So rather than looking at the 60 to 70% of highs and criticals, can look at those vulnerabilities that have an exploit attached to them. And then using The integrations, we have integrations with CyberArk, for instance, with ServiceNow, with Splunk. You can then look to address the risk that you see within your organization as well. Now, our research company, our research organization, they make sure that we are number one in coverage. So we look at the most vulnerabilities in the industry today. They also make sure we're number one in accuracy with the lowest false positive rate. And as you can see from the slide here, already in 2020, they found over 90 zero-day vulnerabilities. It's not just that, it's also the ability to push out the plugins, the detections in a timely manner. And the median for pushing out all of the vulnerabilities or the vulnerability detections is 24 hours or less than 24 hours. They're also a big part of our predictive prioritization. So they look at all of the vulnerabilities that are out there. And although we use CVSS, CVSS isn't dynamic and it doesn't take into account the exploit in a big way. And this is exactly what we've done in the predictive prioritization. So we take about 170 different data points. And from those data points, we're including threat intelligence, we're including information from companies such as Reversing Labs, also information from the dark web, so that we can say, okay, we know we're giving you a 28-day forecast as to exactly what is going to be an issue within those 28 days, looking at vulnerabilities that have been exploited, looking at vulnerabilities that maybe haven't got an exploit attached to them at the moment, but will have within those 28 days. And that enables you, once you've performed a credential scan, to go through and look at the vulnerabilities and make sure that instead of trying to focus on 17,000 different vulnerabilities, or even the 60 or 70% of those, you can focus on exactly what matters. First of all, what's being exploited at the time, test those patches, and then roll those patches out as well. And that's also whether it's we've got an agent, so you can put those on Linux, on macOS, on Windows machines. The Nessus scanner that a lot of people will already be familiar with, and also our Nessus network monitor, which is our passive monitor that sits on the network and finds everything on the network. And one of the big advantages of that is that if you don't know what's in your network, then you don't know where the vulnerabilities are on that network. So let me just hand over to Matt quickly.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Let me just switch to my slide where. So thanks for the introduction into Tenable, but just to quickly introduce CyberArk and who CyberArk are and what we do. So CyberArk is a security company, again, about 20 years old, similar to Tenable. We aim to protect and monitor and audit access to privileged accounts. So privileged accounts are most commonly used by external attackers and malicious insiders to do damage to an organization. So think of your domain admin accounts, local admin accounts, database accounts, that kind of thing, where they have access to a lot of data potentially under the hood. And the general idea of CyberArk is that we aim to protect those accounts, them being obviously a key vector of attacks. So the general idea of CyberArk is that by securely storing and managing these credentials, we can prevent these kinds of internal and external threats being able to access the organization and the data within it. So our general idea is to vault credentials. So about 20 years ago, the CyberArk solution was actually started as a secure file server. And what we found is that doing the research into what our customers were using the solution for, we found that most customers were actually using it primarily as a place to store an Excel spreadsheet full of passwords. And so the wider CyberArk solution kind of grew from that initial sort of use case there. So we've moved away from secure file storage to secure credential storage. And then we allow legitimate access to authorized users via the CyberArk Vault and our kind of external tools around that. But also we allow access to external applications, Tenable being a good example of that. And by securely sort of protecting these credentials, providing only authorized access to the users who need those credentials, the applications or services which require access to those passwords. We can hopefully kind of break up the attack chain, which is kind of the hallmark of these kind of major attacks, which will get you into news. For example, you look at any headline of a major compromise, major theft of data. Almost always, there's the kind of steps I mentioned in this diagram here. So there's initial theft of credentials, initial compromise of the solution, an escalation of privileges. Usually, an attacker starts out with standard privileges. They compromise a user. What they look to do is to steal more elevated privileges, so an administrative account, for example. Once they've stolen that account, then they can do more reconnaissance. They can move laterally from machine to machine or even deeper into the network. And if they get to the point in time where they have access to the data thereafter, then at that point they can start to do the exfiltration, or they can disrupt the business by blocking access, legitimize that same data. So by protecting privileged accounts and access to those privileged accounts, we can provide you with a lot of security around your kind of wider organization. Those accounts being ones that are generally targeted by both external attackers and by malicious insiders who perhaps are a bit disgruntled about the way things are going. So just back to Jonathan, just to come over some of the key points of going through the rest of the webinar.
Okay, thanks, Matt. One of when we talk to customers, one of the issues they have is that trying to push out either agents or trying to scan all the machines in their environment really comes down to then cooperating with different areas of the organization. A network administrator maybe doesn't want to create yet another credential. They have multiple credentials. Maybe they're looking at routers and switches and a number of other different devices, and they don't want to then create yet another just for a vulnerability scan. And it's not that they don't want to create it for the vulnerability scan, but it's just that then they need to manage it, they need to audit that whole thing. And this is really where the integration with CyberArk shines, because being able to create the credentials within CyberArk, then being able to audit who's got access to that particular credential, who's using it at the moment, so we can then audit those as well using CyberArk. And it gives us the ability to do in-depth credential scans with Tenable, and without those in-depth scans, we're not going to get all of the vulnerability information that we want to as well. So we can create the access within CyberArk. CyberArk can also rotate those credentials to change passwords in an automated fashion, which means that from a Tenable admin point of view, that Tenable admin doesn't need to know what the password is. They don't need to know that it's changed. It's all transparent to them. And things like the industry best practice of not giving access to those credentials when they're not needed. If you're scanning servers on a weekend, do you need to enable those credentials throughout the whole week or not? Probably not. And it's probably more secure if you were to actually then go ahead and deny access to those credentials when they're not being used as well. From a Tenable point of view, what does this really mean to us? So between, there's about 2/3 of scans are credentialed. So, it means that there's still a huge amount of scans that don't have authentication linked to them. And that really brings us back to the predictive prioritization, looking at what matters. If we can't see all the vulnerabilities on there because we're not performing credentialed scans, then it really means that we can only surface a certain amount of information for our customers. So performing those scans and giving confidence to the owners of those assets that, number one, the credentials are safe and secure, and number two, using those credentials will give more information, so that we can then drill down and we can look at the 3% or the 7% of vulnerabilities that have exploits attached to them, and really focus on what matters first of all. It's not to say we don't need to worry about the other vulnerabilities that don't have exploits attached to them, but we can leave those maybe to a larger roll-up, maybe to when if we're looking at a Windows desktop and we're using images, maybe to where we're imaging those machines and we put a larger roll-up onto the image itself. So it really comes down to the best way Tenable can surface that information for our customers is to use authenticated scans. And we know from our own data that there's still a lot of customers out there not authenticating those scans. So if we can give the confidence needed to use those authentication and those credentials, then that is much better. So, and some of the goals that we have here, really using Tenable and CyberArk does really give that in-depth authenticated vulnerability scan. And in order to use the predictive prioritization, this is one of the big goals of using the credentials and using authentication within the environment, and then prioritize those results as well, making sure, as I mentioned before, that you're just focusing on whatever's going to give you, going to make sure that there are no exploits in your environment. And that predictive prioritization that we have really does give you the ability to look at what's going to happen in the next 28 days and focus on those vulnerabilities as well. So, just over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Jonathan. Okay, so Jonathan's gone through there and kind of explained why Tenable needs credentials to give you better results in terms of the scans. And from that, we can derive that Nessus scanners require many credentials to be able to carry out those authenticated scans. So obviously to scan each individual server, it needs some way of connecting, be that a local account, a domain account, or some other kind of privilege account, which needs to be able to connect to those servers so that Tenable can generate the data that it needs to provide the reports back to you as a customer. So the temptation or the easy option is to create a relatively weak fixed password that can be reused across those multiple accounts. So Tenable needs an account, so create an account called Tenable, for example, give it a basic password, and then give it access rights to all the servers where Tenable needs that access. And then what's happened there is you've actually introduced a potential vulnerability. So if that credential is misused, if it's stolen by a malicious insider or some sort of external entity, then that credential has a lot of access across the organization. It could be used for potentially nefarious purposes. So Tenable solves one issue, but potentially introduces a slightly different one by adding an extra area of privilege that might be exploited by the right person. So in the event that one of those accounts is breached or the password is stolen, there could be a lot of remedial work to do there. You need to identify all the accounts which share that same password which Tenable is using. You need to reset the password in each of those target systems, and you need to go back into Tenable and update it with the current credential so that it can maintain its scanning regime and keep you up to date with what's going on across your network. So this can take a significant amount of time, and this is where CyberArk comes in as a better source of truth for privileged credentials. So what we can do by implementing the CyberArk solution, we often say within CyberArk that security is a team game. So Tenable has its area of kind of expertise, the scanning, the vulnerability, uncovering that kind of thing. CyberArk is very much the expert in terms of credential management. So we would take the credential that Tenable needs, or the credentials, multiple. We will store them in the CyberArk Vault. Now, the Vault is not just a passive storage location. We actually actively manage credentials. And that means we rotate them periodically. So according to policy, for example, every 30 days, every 10 days, however you want to define that. We can also rotate credentials after every usage, what's called a one-time password. And potentially we can also have to respond to potential theft of a credential where we detect that a privileged account has been logged on, but we think it's an illegitimate log on. We can rotate the credential there as well. And each of those rotations is carried out in a secure manner, and we rotate them according to the policy. So the passes that we generate within CyberArk will be very long, very secure, generally up to the maximum that the target system will allow. So we won't have kind of short 4-digit passwords. We'll have 20, 30-digit credentials, uppercase numbers, special characters, everything you need to create a secure credential, all automatically managed by CyberArk itself. So having stored that into CyberArk, the issue then becomes, how do we provide the access? So there is an integration point with CyberArk and Tenable working together, where Tenable can actually query CyberArk to get the credentials as and when it needs it. So rather than having the hard-coded credential stored within Tenable itself, where it could become out of date or need to be managed actively by a user, we can replace that with effectively an API call to the CyberArk solution. So when Tenable needs to perform a credential scan, rather than referring to its own kind of self-stored configuration, it actually accesses the CyberArk API. We authenticate on the CyberArk side that request, so we know that it's coming from a trusted Tenable source, the Nessus scanner ideally. And then assuming that the access request is legitimate, which generally would be for the Nessus scanners, then we can provide the credential back to the system, back to Tenable itself. So this removes the need to store those passwords kind of statically within Tenable. They only reside within CyberArk, and Tenable dynamically retrieves those credentials as and when needed to run those scans. As an additional benefit, which we'll go into in a bit more depth shortly, we can actually use on the CyberArk side some of the data that Tenable generates about the kind of vulnerability status of these devices to make conditional access decisions. And more on that shortly. So just go into a bit more detail about how this actually works. So Tenable realizes that it's time to make a scan of a target system, and it needs to do a credential scan to get obviously the best data out of there. So what Tenable does, it sends an instruction to the Nessus scanner to begin the scan. The Nessus scanner has an already defined relationship with CyberArk itself. So there's an agent on the Nessus scanners which provides access to the CyberArk solution. So Nessus makes a request for the credentials it needs to do the scan. It sends that request off to the CyberArk vault. CyberArk evaluates that request, realizes that it's from a trusted location, the trusted Nessus scanner, retrieves the credentials from its vault, and then sends it out via the API to the Nessus scanner. So Nessus now has the credential it needs to access that asset. So Nessus takes the credential and logs on to the target system, performs its scan data, and then once it's completed the scan, again informs CyberArk. CyberArk at that point, if the policy is so defined, can choose to reset that password again. So Nessus has effectively used a one-time password to connect to the device and run that scan. So if there's any kind of possibility of the credential being stolen at that point, retrieved from network or from memory, then that again is kind of stamped down as a potential issue by CyberArk rotating that credential. So wherever that credential is used, for example, if there's a Windows box that was being scanned by Nessus, where there's potential of a kind of a past hash style attack where the credential hash is actually stored on the target system, we can invalidate that risk, invalidate that potential location of the credentials by rotating the credential on the CyberArk side. So by using that kind of joint solution, there's plenty of benefits there. So on the Nessus side, you get the benefit of the enhanced scan results using a credential scan, but we also have centralized and secure management of those privileged credentials required for those scans. We can reduce the time and effort required to administer these credentials. So it pretty much is a set and forget scenario on the Nessus scanners. You just define what credential you want to use from CyberArk, and then CyberArk handles all of the management of that credential. And we're also now reducing the attack surface. So these powerful credentials that Nessus is using are actually stored securely in the CyberArk vault and then actively managed by us. And also around that, we have strong audit and compliance capability within CyberArk. So we log every access to privileged credentials. We log where that request has come from, when it happened, all the kind of data that you need to get the visibility over how these credentials are being used. So we give you kind of the full end-to-end visibility of everything which is going on there around the kind of use of these privileged credentials. So that's the kind of use case around the Tenable scanners, the Nessus scanners. But we also have, as I mentioned, the kind of conditional access capability. This is a slightly different use case where, say you have a system which Tenable has scanned and Tenable has found a potential vulnerability there. On the CyberArk side, we not only manage access to credentials for applications and security devices like Tenable, we also manage human access to those devices. So say a vulnerability has been found by Tenable, and now a human user needs to log onto that server and carry out the work to remediate that potential issue. So they would generally go to CyberArk to gain access to the credentials. So they could either see the plain text password, that's quite an old-fashioned way of working, or more likely these days they would use our session management technology to actually connect via CyberArk onto that target system, where we can provide them access but without exposing the credential to the actual user themselves. But also as part of that workflow, we can put some gates through which the user has to pass before they can gain the access. So generally this would be things like, an administrative approval. So for me as an engineer to gain access to that particular server, my manager or the security team needs to manually approve my access request, for example. But we can also do some more advanced things, some more automated kind of workflow processing. And one of those is another integration with Tenable. So when the user accesses or attempts to access a credential in CyberArk, we can send a request off to Tenable for some more information about the system that this user is attempting to gain access to. So if I, as the engineer, want to access server 1, for example, which has been scanned by Tenable and has a vulnerability on there, CyberArk can actually go to Tenable and say, okay, tell me some more about information about the system that this user is trying to access. And that information might come back and say there is a vulnerability. And then CyberArk can use that vulnerability information to make a conditional access decision for that particular user. So if the engineer is a relatively low level engineer, like a line 1 engineer, for example, you might not want them to access a machine which you know has vulnerabilities. So in that case, CyberArk can say, okay, you're only a level 1 engineer, therefore you cannot have access to a vulnerable system. Even if you might ordinarily have access to this credential to this machine, because it's vulnerable, we're going to put it into a more sort of secure bucket. In that case, only a higher level engineer, so for example, a level 3 engineer or a security engineer can access that service, so they can carry the remediation. CyberArk in that case will say, okay, level 1 engineer cannot have access to that target system because it's vulnerable, but a level 3 engineer can because he's authorized to work on insecure systems where there needs to be some remediation work to kind of plug some security gaps there. So that kind of advanced conditional access workflow is kind of built into the CyberArk engine, and that gives you additional benefits around this control of the access. So Tenable detects the vulnerabilities and we control access to those systems to users so that they can't access vulnerable systems unless they're authorized to by the kind of workflow engine itself and the kind of access control model we define there. So you can leverage these integrations to quickly and easily streamline your vulnerability practice. So Tenable does the detection, CyberArk controls access to potentially insecure machines or vulnerable machines. And that can enhance your remediation process. So we give you the rich vulnerability data within Tenable, and then CyberArk acts on that vulnerability data to provide kind of conditional access rules and maintain and secure that kind of access to potentially dangerous systems. So with that, I'll just again hand back to Jonathan for some kind of closing remarks, and then we'll take some questions. So Jonathan, over to you.
Thanks, Matt. So when we're looking at implementing Tenable and CyberArk and really trying to scan our whole environment, I don't think it's any surprise that we always suggest people start off on a small part of the environment, testing those. We have the Nessus scanner, and we also have a Nessus network monitor that is a passive monitor, sits on the network on a network tab span port, and especially if we're looking at OT devices or even printers, sometimes printers, especially some of the older ones, don't like being actively scanned. So having the network monitor on the network where we can still detect that device and still have a look at the vulnerabilities on there is a huge bonus. And have a plan about what you want to look at, first of all, how it's going to get rolled out. If you're going to be scanning everything in your environment, or if maybe, for instance, if you have IP telephony and all the assets, all those devices are exactly the same, or you've maybe got 4 or 5 different models with different firmware and so on, then it could well be a plan to not scan every single one of those if they're exactly the same, but maybe just scan a subset of them. And then testing the organization, and I don't think it's a surprise to anyone, but your environment best. So whether you want to start with the Windows desktops, whether you think there's some vulnerabilities on some older routers, for instance, or whether you want to look at Docker and or some web applications. We can scan all of those. We can look for vulnerabilities in all of those, and it's really the option there is to use your best judgment about what you need to look at first of all. I think I've stressed quite hard that performing credential scans gives you the ability to really get the information that's needed to perform those in-depth scans, get all those the vulnerability information back, and then Tenable can provide the predictive prioritization information needed, so you don't need to try and tackle every single high and critical vulnerability in your organization as a priority. The credential rotation and the changes within there, having CyberArk manage that, it takes a lot of work out of everything. Similar to using Tenable IO or Tenable SC, our enterprise products, instead of Nessus Pro and a huge spreadsheet. They simplify everything and make sure that the people working can actually get on with their work rather than trying to manage either credentials or manage a spreadsheet full of vulnerabilities as well. And using Nessus and the Nessus Network Monitor and CyberArk, you can look for your entire attack surface, so all of the assets, all the vulnerabilities in your organization, and then the compliance with internal, external controls. So whether you're looking at Cyber Essentials, whether as a public sector, you're looking at the PSN, being able to comply with those controls is extremely important. And rather than just maybe looking at the highs and criticals, there are certain vulnerabilities that these controls don't take into account, so the mediums with exploits attached to them, for instance. So it's all very important. And the most important thing really is to use credential scans in order to find all of the vulnerabilities in your environment as well. So with that, just like to thank everyone, and we are now open for questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Matthew. So yeah, we do have a bit of time for questions now. If you do have anything you'd like to quiz the guys on, there should be a Q&A box that you can use on the webinar. Do submit those. We actually had one or two throughout, so I'll make a start with those while any more come through. So I suppose a question to you both. First question is, how is the CyberArk and Tenable integration configured?
I guess that's primarily one for me to take. So the kind of technicality of how it works is, as I briefly mentioned in the chat there is an agent which needs to be installed on the Nessus scanners. So this is installed on the actual operating system itself, which then provides access back to the central CyberArk vault. And then what happens is, within the kind of configuration within a Tenable for these Nessus scanners, you define which credential you want to pull out. So this would be, for example, the internal name within Cybrach of that credential. So for example, the local admin account on server 1, for example, is what we need for this particular scan. So you don't need to know the name of the account, as in the username, or the password. You just need to know the kind of reference name within Cybrach for that credential. So as and when that credential changes within Cybrach, the Nessus scanner just has that kind of dynamic access to the kind of the account ID as opposed to the actual name itself there. So it's primarily an agent on the Nessus scanners which drives that integration.
Thank you for that, Matthew. Another question here. How does CyberArk work alongside Active Directory in terms of authentication? Is it a replacement?
That's quite an unusual question. So generally what we see with customers who don't have a PAM solution in place currently is that they fall into kind of two brackets. One is where users have a personal account which they use, which has privileges. In AD, for example, they might have a personal account which is a standard user, but also a personal account, a mattest.adm, which has like domain name privileges. Generally, what we advise with CyberArk is that the credentials for the privileged accounts are stored within CyberArk itself, but the access to CyberArk, as in how you log on to CyberArk to get access to privileged credentials, is AD integrated with MFA ideally. So you log on to CyberArk with your standard account, so your mattest account, for example, authenticate with your AD password and ideally with MFA as well to kind of secure that. But then once you're logged onto CyberArk, then you gain access to either your mattest.adm account or to some generic accounts, maybe like a domain admin one account, for example, which is then shared amongst the team. So we try to contain privilege, but not necessarily replace LDAP or AD entirely. But we do recommend that you have almost like a single sign-on solution tied into AD. So you log on to CyberArk itself with your primary credentials. Then everything after that is accessed via the privilege account, which is managed by CyberArk, ideally with no access to credential directly. So you never see the password to your mattest.adm account. That's managed purely by CyberArk. So no, we're not replacing it to AD. We kind of put some additional protection around AD and secure access using AD, is the way to put that.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Another one for you both. So it says, I thought Nessus Pro now didn't send credentials in clear text. So other than my credentials expiring, why use CyberArk over just using my domain admin credentials?
So it's really the CyberArk, and this might be something that you want to add to as well, Matt, but from a Tenable point of view, you can use whatever credentials are necessary, but the more and more credentials that you have in your environment, and we'd also always recommend that you have a specific Nessus or a specific Tenable set of credentials rather than just using the standard Windows domain credentials. It comes to a point where you have so many credentials, so many passwords in your environment that you need to be able to manage those properly.
Yeah, and just to add to that, so yes, correct passwords aren't generally exposed in plain text across the network, for example. So RDP, for example, is an encrypted protocol now. But the issue becomes if you're not regularly rotating passwords or implementing things like one-time passwords, if Tenable logs on to, say, a Windows server to do a scan, that logon results in a hash of that password being stored on that target machine, and that hash can be stolen and misused even without having access to the plain text password. And the only real way to kind of combat that is either to switch off password hashes altogether, which has a lot of kind of knock-on effects, or by implementing password rotation. So password hashes on target machines, on servers, for example, can be invalidated just by resetting the password because the hash is now no longer related to the existing password, it's related to an older password. So active password management can provide you additional security on your target machines.
Brilliant. One more question at the moment, probably one for Matthew. How can we ensure high availability with CyberArk?
So HA is built into the solution, so there are no single points of failure within it. So we tend to talk about the CyberArk Vault, but ideally you'd have more than one. So the standard license includes up to 5 vaults, which can be deployed in HA mode or a kind of primary NDR model, depending on your kind of use case and requirements. And likewise, the access from Nessus, the Nessus scanners into CyberArk itself can be kind of load balanced. So the access from Nessus into CyberArk itself can be across a resilient kind of set of connections. So I mentioned one connection to one API. It could be multiple connections to multiple effectively individual deployments of that particular API. So there is no kind of single point of failure there. Like I say, when we say CyberArk Vault, we actually mean the vault kind of infrastructure as opposed to a single vault. And HANDR is very much part of that vault infrastructure.
Great, thank you, Matthew. One more for you. They're flowing in today, so bear with us. What CyberArk license components are needed?
So you need this kind of standard CyberArk license, what we call a core PAS license. But then for application access, what we call application access manager, that's the license component, you need to have licenses for external systems like Nessus to be able to connect. So the AM license is licensed per device. So in this particular use case, you would need to have an AM license for each of the Nessus scanners that you wanted to have access to privileged credentials. So if you had 10 Nessus scanners, you need 10 AM licenses for that kind of CyberArk integration to work.
Great stuff. Another one possibly on the CyberArk side. Are there any limitations on the types of credentials that can be stored in CyberArk for use with Tenable?
No is the short answer. So pretty much anything that you can name can be stored in CyberArk. So out of the box, we have integrations for several hundred different types of application or target system. So obviously that covers the most commonly used one, Windows, domain local accounts, database accounts, Unix passwords and SSH keys. So anything that that Tenable needs to do the scans, so if it needs to get an SSH key for a particular Linux machine, for example, that can be exposed by the CyberArk API and stored in the CyberArk Vault and managed, rotated, just the same as any other kind of credential, and access provided via that same API to Tenable to actually conduct the scans. So there's really no limitation around what kind of credential you can actually store in CyberArk and provide access to Tenable to.
Brilliant, thank you, Matthew. And just one last point, are we able to point the attendees from today in the direction of any more, I suppose, technical resource about the integration, if they did want to hear more from a technical perspective?
Yep, so obviously there's lots of documentation around how this works on a technical level. So the best place to find that is either on the Tenable website or on the CyberArk website. So if you go to docs.tenable.com and just search for CyberArk within the kind of help documentation there, there's a guide there about how this integration works, the kind of requirements on both the Tenable side and on the CyberArk side. And likewise, that same information is available on the CyberArk Marketplace. So if you just Google CyberArk Marketplace, that will take you to our website where we have all the integrations, not just Tenable. But within there, we have obviously the downloads and the files you would need to enable the integration, but also all the documentation around how you define both the CyberArk side of things and the Tenable side of things to make that connection work.
Excellent, excellent, thank you. I think that's it for the questions for now. We'll hold on a minute or so for any others that may come through, but if anyone thinks of one later on the day that they didn't get to ask, do feel free to send over an email to tell me more at Bytes, or get in touch with myself, with your account manager. We're all here on hand to answer any further questions you have. Likewise, if you wanted to have a more direct conversation with the CyberArk or Tenable teams, we're more than happy to arrange that as well, of course. Other than that, I'd like to thank Matthew and Jonathan for their time this morning and speaking and lending their knowledge to us all. And of course, for all of you attending, thank you very much for taking an hour out of your morning to hear more about this subject. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.